Welcome back to Vital MX, and it is new bike day. It is time for the first look on the 2024 Kawasaki KX450 and KX450X. And as with all of our breaking news, rumors, things of that nature, this feature is brought to you by our friends at Yoshimura R&D of America. Check them out at yoshimura-rd.com and thank them for their support. So we continue to do videos such as this. And yes, we have seen this bike since the beginning of the year in the MXGP series, at least the racer prototype version, in the hands of Romain Febvre and Mitch Evans for the Kawasaki MXGP team. But here it is. Here's the production trim of the bike. We finally get to learn a little bit more details, or at least a written out version of what is going on with this new machine. But before we jump into it, I'm going to apologize for the lack of visuals and the lack of exact technical information. Kawasaki was very bare with this PR release. We do not have a spec sheet. We don't know what it weighs. We don't know what the rake and trail is. Things of that nature that usually are around when they launch a new bike. And we were given 3 photos. One of each side of the bike and an angled photo. So there's going to be some zoomed in, cropped a few things, but we don't have individual parts photos for some of the items we're going to be talking about. Now, first up, this is an all-new generation KX450 for Kawi, the first time in 5 years, and it is well brought about change. We've been waiting for some updates. The outgoing KX450, even though it had been around for 5 years, got very minimal changes during its life. It pretty much got one mid-generation update that included a little bit of mapping, head pipe, and clutch. And really, other than that, they've never done anything with that bike. Kind of odd to us because even from the first year it came out, there were some comments related to the fork setting, maybe a little bit more power could be used, a couple things, and they just kind of left it out there. It was a good platform. A lot of people really liked it and won a lot of shootouts. And it's a very good base bike to work with. And with that, we can tell that Kawasaki is trying to carry a lot of that into this new generation based on some of the comments. And also they are targeting the few key areas that they received criticism about in their prior bike, most notably in the power department. Kawasaki has a well-balanced frame. It has a lot of comfort built into the chassis. It doesn't feel too rigid, but at the same time, it doesn't feel like it wallows around. So the updates to the chassis that we're seeing with this bike aren't really to change the character, but as much adapt for some of the power changes. We have a shock tower in the bike that's been lowered and the shock angle has been changed. That's to bring in the new raised intake to do more of a downdraft style intake into the bike like we see on the Yamahas and the Hondas. And then also a raised center cradle in the front of the frame to have a center port style exhaust, something again that's very common amongst their competition. The only thing they really mention about wanting to change on the frame's characteristic is improve the rigidity factor enough just to get a little bit more front end bite and feel, but try to maintain or retain their comfort levels that most people are used to when it comes to this bike. And again, if you look at, we don't have geometry numbers, but it doesn't look too dissimilar from a geometry standpoint. It looks like it even carries over the same swing arm potentially. And speaking of ergonomics, yes, we still have the optional foot peg mount holes on the bike and also the 4 positions in the stock triple clamps. Again, a lot of these updates are really about the power. We have an all-new cylinder head. This includes a new piston, new head, new valves, new cams, completely new port design. Again, we have a different air box into throttle body that drops down into the motor at a steeper angle, or more of a straight angle in this case is what you would consider it. Again, being a downdraft, they have brought that intake now above the shock tower, so it has a more straight shot into the engine. This allows your fuel and air for, a more efficient tumble, air to fuel shear, whatever they're working on, to try to get it into the engine, into the combustion chamber a little bit more efficiently. And then the center port exhaust is so we don't have uneven exhaust ports. We can get everything out a little bit more efficiently. This also includes an all-new exhaust with a head pipe that, oddly enough, has an expansion chamber that looks really similar to the current Honda design. The airbox itself is more of a toolless design. Yes, the last one we had to pop a bolt for the side panel. The new one looks like it has a pop style panel and supposedly is a little bit easier to access and work on than the outgoing version. Again, with the engine, we don't know a lot about the bottom end. It looks to have the same basic cases and side covers as the outgoing engine. We expect there to be a few minor updates in the bottom half of the motor, but we expect the majority of this to really be focused on that top end. And with all the new bodywork, you can imagine that the cooling system is probably a little bit different, the routing of the electronics, etc. Speaking of the bodywork, personally, big fan of the new Kawi look. Like to hear your guys' thoughts in the comments section below. I felt like the old bike, some of the lines didn't match up with the frame. It almost looked a little incomplete up at the radiator shrouds. This one has a really nice flow to it. A lot of green this year, a lot of green plastic, a lot of area to put graphics on. Maybe not as much of a shrunk side panel design as we've seen from some of the OEMs, so that's nice to have. Speaking of the electronics, this is where another huge update is coming to this bike. So forever, Kawai's had the coupler system. No more. They're gone. We have a handlebar mounted switch, more similar to the competition, that has not only a kill function, it also has a launch control function. It has your map option 1 and 2, and in the standard setting, that will be your standard map and then a mellow map. And then it also has a switch that goes through 3 modes of KTRC, Kawasaki Traction Control. Kawasaki has had a version of traction control built into the ECU for years now that's just always kind of active. If it senses a really aggressive RPM spike, it suggests that that could be rear wheel spin, and sometimes they'll tweak the mapping a little bit to try to restrict the power. Well, now you can toggle that off, on, and actually there's 2 versions on. There is a more mellow intrusive and a little bit more aggressive intrusive system. So again, with that switch, you can pick which version you want on off. As for the mapping, again, we don't have couplers. We don't have the big Game Boy looking thing to change the maps in it anymore. If you did buy one of those accessory tools, it now has an app, Rideology. Somebody has finally stepped into Yamaha's footsteps and followed them with a tunable app. We haven't seen the app yet, what it has, but we'd have to guess that they at least tried to bare minimum meets or be similar to what Yamaha has, which would allow us to modify the ignition curves, the fuel curves, put notes in there, check hours on the bike, maybe even modify the launch control, which would be cool. Again, something similar we see on the Yamaha. So these are all things that have made that bike very popular. And when you have a 450 that you're trying to gain power output of, mostly also from what we can tell will probably be mid to top. That's kind of where the outgoing Kawi was the most lacking. As we've seen with the Yamaha, you can build an aggressive power plant and then you can just change the mapping. If it's too much for you, back it down. You like it standard? Cool. And then there's a lot of options that give it a more aggressive character, a quicker revving character. Again, the apps are just so much fun if you like to play and tweak with your bike instead of having to go out and spend hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to try different things to get different character out of your bike. Some of it is available literally at the touch of your phone screen and you Bluetooth it right to the bike. On the suspension side of things, we still have Showa components, front and rear. The front fork seems to be the same design that they had before. Nothing looks too different there. We can imagine the internal setting is different, and hopefully something they learned when they did the SRs. Again, on the outgoing Kawasaki 450, one of the biggest complaints was the front forks were pretty darn soft, and they never updated that setting the entire existence of that 5-year run. However, with the SR, when they initially did the KYBs on it and then went back to the Showa, they retested those settings just for the SR, and they had way better balance on the bike. Yes, it was a more aggressive, stiff setting, but even for the vast majority of people riding the bike, it was better because the balance of the bike was better. The attitude of the bike was better. It makes it safer, easier to ride. Hopefully from what they learned from the SR, they brought into this bike. The shock design itself is a little bit different because, again, having the lowered shock tower, the shock's at more of an angle. The body's been changed. The reservoir is hidden behind the frame now. It is still in a vertical fashion, but it is tucked behind the left-hand spar of the frame, and you can access your high and low speed compression adjuster from between a gap in the frame and the plastic on the left side of the bike. But other than that, we're still on a spring fork, spring shock, nothing too unique there, nothing crazy coming out of Kawasaki, very predictable components, ones that guys are used to working on. And again, with a chassis that doesn't have a massive overhaul in geometry, this should be a bike that's going to be fairly easy to set up. 2 main key things to wrap this up. This bike has a Brembo brake on the front. That was the most shocking thing when I read through the PR and got me the most excited. We've been talking about forever how good the Brembos are on the Austrian bikes. Not that the Nissans can't stop, they just don't have as good modulation and feel. They're a little bit grabby, especially with the Kawi having a 270mm rotor in past years. It's a lot of power, but it's not always the easiest to use. We have a new pedal style brake rotor, front floating rotor to go with this Brembo caliper, and it looks to be basically the same caliper we find on the KTM, the Husqvarnas, the Gasgases, etc. So very excited to see that on this bike. It is still paired with a Nissan rear though. However, I guess that's not shocking. That's probably a cost-related item, but we do have Brembos up front. And then lastly, the almighty, the hated vulcanized grips. They're gone. We have ODI lock-ons. We finally are not going to have to take a wire wheel to get chunks of this leftover grip off the left side of the handlebar. We have ODI lock-ons. Most people are going to prefer that over the stock Kawasaki grips, but even if you don't, they're as simple as undoing a little bit of Allen bolt, pulling off and putting on whatever you get a throttle tube, get whatever grips you want. Again, just a little bit easier step for the consumer. This bike is coming in at MSRP of $10,399. It is up around $600 or $700 MSRP over the outgoing edition. Pretty expected with this many updates. Still cheaper than some of the Austrian models, but definitely getting up there in price. And of course, something not any of us want to see as things get a little bit tougher in the world. But yep, new features, new bikes, new price. Lastly, the availability for this bike is listed as fall. From what we've heard internally, it sounds like media-wise, we might be riding this bike late in September. We'd expect it to be in the hands of dealerships and to consumers sometime in October. Don't quote us on that. Could be a little bit earlier, could be a little bit later. But we think a early to mid-October might be a decent at least point to put on the calendar right now if you're interested in one of these bikes. Sadly, it is again being announced now. No, you won't be able to go get it in a month or two. It's going to be a little bit. So love to hear your thoughts on this bike, what you think of the updates and the upgrades in the comments section down below. Again, looks like Kawasaki has tried not to venture too far from the current handling characteristic. The biggest thing is getting an engine that has more mid to top, a broader power character, and more there that you can play with their new Rideology app. Thanks for watching our first look. Thumbs up, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.